Janice. As a family of 8, one of the things that we do is to go through an awful lot of groceries. And because of that, one of the things that we are grateful for, though, are the existence of places like Sam's and Costco, because we're able to buy in bulk there. And at the end of the day, I like both stores because there's some stuff that one store has that the other doesn't, and vice versa. But one of the things that's a standout between the two stores that I really appreciate and leads me to perhaps appreciate Costco more is that their samples are markedly better. And if you have been to both stores, Costco's samples are significantly better and significantly more numerous. In fact, there are times I feel like that if you could time it right around lunchtime, you could kind of go through there and just cruise the sample area. And if somehow you could get them to give you a drink of something, you could just have lunch in the sample lines at Costco. And so it has been like that for some period of time until COVID hit. And once the pandemic began, that changed how everything was going on. And so it's not simply that we were wearing masks, but also that we were bathing in hand sanitizer because we didn't want to touch anything. And so it kind of stands to reason that you don't want to put samples out if you don't want people to touch stuff. And so certainly at Sam's, they just kind of stopped. But what was interesting to me at Costco was this, and if you have been a shopper at Costco over the past year, you know what I'm getting ready to describe. It was really bizarre because at the same normal times that you would find samples at Costco, you would go in there and there would be an employee standing at some sort of display table with some sort of food product. It could be meatballs, or it could be cheese, it could be some sort of dip, it could be pimento cheese, it could be whatever it is that they're hawking. But that particular item will be set up there, nicely displayed, but they would have plexiglass around it, and it would have a sign that says display only. And there was an employee standing there working the table. I'm like, I don't get this. Like, your job is a sample server, but you're just standing there. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. In fact, repeatedly, and I would watch them because you'd see sometimes people would try to reach around to grab, no, I'm sorry, that's just display only. And so my thought is, in observing this and watching all this, is this, that's just kind of useless, isn't it? That doesn't make any sense to have someone serving samples that's not actually serving samples. They're just kind of, well, they're decorative. That's useless. Now, in the scheme of things, generally, when we find something or render something to be useless, what do? We want to get rid of it, or we elect it, or we marry it. I don't know. You're just joking. Anyway, generally speaking, what we do, though, when something is useless, we say that is of no benefit, that there's no value add, and because of that, I want to jettison it. I want to get rid of it. There's no use keeping this because it has no benefit. It has no use. Now, that being said, let me ask you this. The fact that you are here today in person, and that those of you who are watching online, you are spending part of your day engaged in a worship service, either online or in person, suggests that you are, to some degree, a religious person, at least nominally, or maybe you're curious and you're just trying to get some answers, but you are thinking religious thoughts, you are thinking about matters of faith. And that being said, let me ask you this. Do you want your faith to be one? Are you interested in having a faith that is useless, of no benefit? I mean, hopefully you would say, no, I don't want that. I don't want any part of my life to be just useless. I want everything that's a part of my life to matter and to have consequence. And especially when it comes to matters of faith, I want my faith, I want my walk with God to actually be of consequence. Now, while it is the case that you may want that, it is entirely possible for a person to have. And maybe you here today or someone watching today, if the truth is told, it's not that there is an absence of faith, but rather the faith that is present is useless. So here's the question. This is what we're going to think about today. How can I tell if I have a useless faith? How can I tell if I have a useless faith? This comes to us as the end of a series that we started at the beginning of August that I've been calling Bad Religion, when good Christianity goes bad. And it's possible for someone to be very religious and to be very faith-focused, but the faith that they have to be useless. Hopefully you don't want that, so how can you tell if you fall into that category? Look with me in your Bibles today to James chapter 1. James chapter 1, and we're going to start reading just a couple of verses, starting with verse 26. James chapter 1, starting with verse 26. God speaks through James to say this: if anyone thinks he is religious without controlling his tongue, his religion is what? Useless. And he deceives himself. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. All right, so he's not just talking about religion and expressions of faith in general, but he's saying that it's possible to have an expression of faith that is useless. How can you tell if that's you? Based on what he says, the first thing I would say is this: you need to ask yourself, does my faith produce controlled speech? Does my faith produce controlled speech? I don't want to have a useless faith, so how can I tell? Well, I need to answer this question. Does what I profess, does what I purport to have, does it produce controlled speech? Now, this comes to us in what is for many their favorite book of the Bible, or at least maybe one of their favorite books in the New Testament, because the book of James is so amazingly practical. And it's not to say that the book of James doesn't contribute in terms of what it is that we believe as far as ideas, ideals, beliefs, and doctrine, but it is thinking more about the expression, the living out of faith and our beliefs. And that's why you see, for example, back in verse 22 of chapter 1, God used James to say this: to be doers of the word and not hearers only. So he's thinking brass tacks, where the rubber meets the road. It's not just enough to have right faith, right belief, to get stuff here and here, but that it demonstrates itself. It manifests itself in action, in the living out of your life. And with that in mind, he says, it starts with a hypothetical in verse 26, where he says, if anyone thinks of themselves to be a religious person. Now, the word that's translated as religious there literally means a God-fearer or a worshiper of God. So if anyone says, hey, I am a worshiper of God, I'm someone who would fall into the category where I would say I'm a fearer of God, I'm a worshiper of Him. Are you in that category? If you're watching online, are you in that category? If the answer is yes, pay attention to what follows. Because on the surface, you could just pause and say, well, if you are a worshiper of God, bravo. That's wonderful. If you believe yourself or present yourself to be religious, a fearer of God, a worshiper of God, James doesn't say, well, just bravo, 3 cheers for you. He continues by saying, if that's the case, think about something. And that's this. If you fall into that category, but you do not have control over your tongue, if you are not controlling your speech, that what you are doing, that your worship of God, that your professions of the fear of God, they are what? They are useless. They are of no benefit. They are of no consequence. They don't really matter. You are wasting your time. Now, the word that's translated as controlling there is the same word that's used to describe what goes on with a horse when you put a bridle on it, when you control that big animal. I mean, you think about how much larger a horse is than you. It's amazing that you can control it. Why? By what you put in its mouth. And so he says that if you profess to be someone that has a personal connection with God, that you are a worshiper of God, if you're in that category, ask yourself this: does my experience of faith, does my worship of Him, does my professed relationship with Him have a byproduct that is described as controlled speech? Now, what exactly does that look like, to have controlled speech? Let me answer it this way. When I was in seminary, my second and third years there, I lived in an apartment off campus. And it had nothing to do with the seminary. It was just a little apartment complex there in Wake Forest. And I got over those couple of years to know at least the neighbors in the units immediately around me. And for whatever reason, most of them in this complex were senior adults. And so there was one guy, and I can't remember his name, that he lived across the hall from me. And we would talk if we were out and about at the same time, and we got to know each other a bit. And one day we were in conversation, and I said something along the lines of this: "Do you know where that's at?" And he says, "Do I know where it is?" I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "The question is, do I know where it is?" He said, "Where it's at, you just ended a sentence with a preposition. You don't end a sentence with a preposition." And I thought, well, you know, you're right. You're right. Every time I had a conversation with that guy afterwards, you know what I did? I'm telling you, I thought before I spoke, because this is a guy that is paying attention and wants to speak proper English and to use correct grammar. And to the extent possible, I want to make sure to this very day that I don't end a sentence with a preposition. I don't want to do that. And why is that? It's because I became mindful of the person whose presence I was in, and that affected how I would speak. If you are someone who professes to be a worshiper of God, one who fears God, who's in relationship with Him, hopefully you're aware of the fact that there is not a place that you can go where you escape His presence. Here, there, and everywhere, He is. If you are a real, meaningful worshiper of God and your faith is not useless, you will be mindful of that such that your speech reflects it. What does it look like to have controlled speech? I think maybe one of the best ways to think about it is, what does it look like to have undisciplined or uncontrolled speech? Let me ask you this. Do you find yourself having to regularly go and undo a mess that you have made with your mouth? I mean, do you regularly have to go to others and say, "I am so sorry that I said that. I'm so sorry. I just blurted that out without thinking. Please forgive me." Do you find yourself regularly in verbal confrontations and arguments with other people? Do you find yourself saying things that you would say away from here that in a million years you would want anybody in this room to hear you say? If the answer to those things is yes, that's a pretty clear indicator that the type of speech that you're operating with, it's out of bounds. And it's not how God wants somebody who says, "I am in relationship with Him, I'm a worshiper of His, I'm a fearer of His." Well, then that should be affected by what you say. Why is that? I think Vance Havner said it best years ago when he said this: "What's down in the well comes up in the bucket." And what we say is indicative of and reflects what's going on in the heart. And at the end of the day, if I am speaking in undisciplined, uncontrolled ways, that's reflective of the fact, not that I have a speech problem, but I have a problem on the inside. And the faith that I say that I have is woefully deficient. The walk that I have with God that I have, ultimately, God used James to say is what? It's useless. I don't want a useless faith. Hopefully you don't as well. So answer this question. Does the faith that you have, does it produce controlled speech? There's another question that you should ask, and that's this. Does my faith generate selfless service? Does my faith generate selfless service? Now, by contrast to having a useless religion, James flips in verse 27 to describe pure and undefiled religion. This is what it should look like. This is how it can and could operate. And that's this, that it looks like this, where you are looking after orphans and widows in their distress. You're looking after orphans and widows in their distress. Now, for this to make sense, you need to step back and to do some evaluation for a moment and realize, first of all, that 21st century American life is vastly different than first century Roman life. And one of the things that is the case, and it is especially the case in the United States after Roosevelt's New Deal policies that came about after the Great Depression, and then Lyndon Johnson's declared war on poverty, a whole slew of social safety nets began to be enacted in government life and practice, such that there are programs like food stamps, such that there are programs that assist with housing to provide free or low-income housing, an entire system where health care at reduced or free or no cost can be given. And this is just touching the tip of the iceberg, there are a stack of safety nets in our society and culture where individuals who are in economic need or distress where the government has things in place that make sure those needs are taken care of. Young or old, regardless of where you live, there are places, there are systems in place to help with this. Now that's 21st century American life. That's not first century Roman life. And first of all, it was a particularly patriarchal society. And so if you have a woman who is married, in all likelihood, it would have been unusual for her to have been a landowner herself, and her primary responsibility would have been managing the affairs of the home, while the husband would be out working the fields or running the store, running the business, doing whatever. So he was the breadwinner, and she was the bread cooker. And so that's what was going on. And if he died, if something happened to him, she was going to be in a world of hurt, because she would still be responsible for the affairs of the household, but there's no income to take care of it. If you're a boy or a girl and mom and dad dies, and think about it, first century, I mean, what kind of medicine was there? I mean, there was almost nothing. It was like, here's an oil, rub some dirt on it, walk it off. That's about the best you could hope for. Life expectancy wasn't particularly long in the first century, and so if you are a little boy or a little girl and something happens to mom or dad, or mom and dad, unless other family takes you in, and if there's no other family, you're in a world of hurt. I mean, you absolutely are effectively helpless. You're going to be out on the streets and just hoping for and wanting the kindness and the generosity of others. When James talks about this is not a stretch to a first century listener. They would have known people like this. They would have observed people like this. In fact, some of them hearing this would have said, hey, I know what it's like to be in that category. And so James says, useful, meaningful religion, pure and undefiled religion, is to make sure that those types of needs, he says what? They are what? Verse 27, that you look after these individuals, that you make sure that these needs, to the extent possible, that they are met. Now that's inside the church, that's outside the church. But let me ask you this, why do you think it was that he specifically said orphans and widows? Why didn't he go through a whole laundry list of people that would have needs? I mean, someone who was physically disabled, or someone that had lost a job, or had been taken advantage of in some form or fashion. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things that could have been described where we're just told orphans and widows. Well, I believe, first of all, that he's not talking and giving an exhaustive list, but there's a more general principle that's being communicated here. And how I would describe it is this. Last weekend, Labor Day weekend, there was a bluegrass festival. It's called Camp Springs. It's not far outside of Reidsville. And it went on Friday evening, Saturday, and then Sunday afternoon and into the evening. And it was a pretty poor lineup, and some of you may think that every bluegrass lineup is pretty poor, but anyway, Friday I thought there was nobody that I was really interested in seeing, and I had no interest in paying more money to buy a ticket for Friday. And so I didn't want to go, but Philip, our third son, really wanted to go. And he had been talking about, hey, I still think we ought to go Friday. I thought, can we go on Friday? And he had been getting a very consistent no from me. But I guess at some point, he could smell what he thought was weakness. And all of a sudden, Philip starts doing some stuff. You want me to heat something up for you for lunch? I had cut grass, and there was a spot down near the mailbox. Somehow I missed, and I said, I'm gonna have to get the mower back out and cut that. I'll get the. I'll do that. You want to take the trash out? He was so nice, so very, very helpful. Until he got a very clear answer. No, we're not going tonight. We're not going on Friday night. But let me ask you this. He was doing very good, very helpful, very nice things. But why was he doing these things? Because he was wanting to get something from me in return. Why in the world do you think orphans and widows are described here? Why help them? Because these were people that couldn't give you anything in return. These were folks that you scratched their back, and they had no means to be able to scratch yours. That you give them some financial assistance, there was no way that they would ever be able to repay them. And so it's not simply that you are doing the right thing, but you are doing the right thing, and you are assisting, and you are serving others, and it's selfless service. You're not doing it to self-promote, not to get what you want in return, but you're doing this. You are meeting need because you view that person as valuable. That person is consequential. That person matters to God, and because of that, they're going to matter to me. They can't ever repay me, but God knows what I'm doing. God is paying attention. That's the type of faith, that's the type of walk that He wants me to have, that He wants you to have, unless your walk with Him is useless. A useless walk would lead you to say whatever you want. There's effectively no restraint, no control. And it's not necessarily that you never ever help other people, that you never do anything to assist and to come alongside someone. But truth be told, and maybe others may not know this, but in your heart you may know this, that the reason you're doing it is because you feel like there's some sort of payday that's going to be for this. If that's the case, you may be a very religious person. You may do a lot of faith talk, but the faith that you profess, the faith that you actually have, God says through James, it's useless. There's one final question that we need to ask in determining where we are in this, and that's this. Does my faith prompt intentional protection? Does my faith prompt intentional protection? What does that mean? Look at verse 27. So again, he's just talked about in verse 26, hey, this is what it looks like to have useless, worthless, of no benefit faith. And then he says on the flip side, starting in verse 27, these are some things that should be true of useful, meaningful, beneficial faith. One is that you're looking after orphans and widows in their distress. And he says this, to keep oneself unstained from the world. To keep oneself unstained from the world. Well, what does it mean to be unstained from the world? And you don't have to think much about that or for very long at all before you realize, hey, this is talking about me seeking to make sure that spiritually I'm staying clean. That there are boundaries that God has erected, some stuff that He wants me to do and not to do, and I'm going to operate within those boundaries that He's put up for my good. And so because of your faith, you are seeking to spiritually stay clean. You are intentionally seeking to make sure that you, as a person of faith, as a follower of God, as a worshiper of His, that you actually look like, in terms of your life, you look like a God follower, a God worshiper, that your life is different than those that don't do that don't have that same relationship, that you're operating not on the standards of culture, which say essentially you can do as you please, but you're operating based on His standards. Now hopefully you realize and you're mindful of the fact that you and I are in a culture and we are surrounded by an environment that is not characterized by being God-fearers and God-worshipers. We are regularly inundated. It's like we are being saturated with a fire hydrant from all the influences of a culture that is seeking to get us to do just what we want and not to do the things that God wants, to act out of bounds. And the encouragement for me, for you as a follower of His that has a useful faith is this, that you realize I can't escape this culture. I can't escape this environment. This is where I am. I am living here in this world and in this culture that's at odds with Him, that is headed in the opposite direction. And I realize that they are trying to get me to follow their lead, and so I'm going to try to, and I'm going to seek to be intentional in guarding myself against that influence. We are now almost in the middle of September, and it's really nice that it's not 1,000,000 degrees outside, and we're coming up on fall, and that's really for me, and maybe for you as well. That's my favorite season. I love, in particular, the cool mornings and the cool evenings and the low humidity. I really like it. But it won't be long before the temperature really starts to drop, and I don't know if it'll happen by the end of October, but certainly by the time we get into November, what will happen, especially at night, is that the temperature will fall and it'll get below 32 degrees. Now, once it gets below 32 degrees, one of the things that you're aware of is that at that point water can freeze, including the dew that forms. And so as a kid, I understood what that meant by the time you got to around November, which is that if you had been out with our parents and came back home in the evening, one of the things that you would do is to make sure that the trunk gets open, and they had this roll of plastic, big, thick, heavy plastic. I don't know where we got it, but what you would do is you would open one door, and you would put it in, shut the door on that side, then pull it across the windshield, open that door, shove it in, close that door, and it pretty well covered the whole width and breadth of the windshield. And you do that every night. It was an aggravation until you go out the next morning, and then you just take it off, and there's no frost on your windshield. It's an aggravation until you realize it's a whole lot greater aggravation to be out there scraping when it's 27 degrees outside. And so what we were doing with that, we weren't escaping the environment. We were just seeking to guard ourselves from what we were in. Seeking to guard ourselves, to protect ourselves in the environment in which we were operating. Listen, as someone, hopefully you are someone that says, I am a God worshiper. I'm a person of faith. I do lean on and I'm dependent on and I have a relationship with the Lord based on what Christ has done for me. That's true of me. Hopefully, the one that you have is one that is useful. And if your relationship with Him is useful and meaningful and it actually has consequences, then you are going to intentionally seek to guard yourself from the environment in which we're operating. That doesn't mean that you go hide in a cave somewhere, but it does mean that you take intentional efforts to guard your heart and mind. What does that mean? I think it means operating with some discernment. In fact, some prayerfully based discernment where you say, Lord, I need your help in seeing clearly what I'm dealing with. Lord, I need you to help me to see clearly the environment that I'm operating in. And first of all, help me to see the people in my life that are within my circles of influence that could be pulling me astray. Maybe that's a boyfriend or a girlfriend and that relationship needs to change. Maybe it's a coworker and there's some boundaries that need to be erected. Maybe there are some safeguards that need to take place so that you mitigate or minimize the influence. That doesn't mean that you don't speak to them and that you treat them rude and you go live in a commune. It's not that at all. But you prayerfully say, Lord, help me to see relationships that are possibly going to pull me astray. Lord, help me to see, because keep in mind, we are saturated by media input. And I don't just mean like news media, but I mean entertainment and social media. And I mean, we've got these computers on our hips now that we used to call phones that we are just saturated, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, it's the internet, it's all of these influences, and many of them are influences and are seeking to communicate a worldview and a position that's not going to lead me closer to God, but it's going to lead me further away. The person that has a useful faith, a useful walk with God says, Lord, I need your help, and I want to guard that. I'm not going to allow everything to cross into my eyes. I'm not going to allow everything into my ears because I realize you've helped me to see that those are threats, and I want to guard myself against that. I'm in this culture, but I want to stay as unstained as I can possibly be. Lord, are there habits, are there disciplines and practices that are common around me that I need to make sure that aren't part of my life, that I guard myself against those so that I don't get out of bounds? The person that has a useful faith, a meaningful faith, one that actually matters, they are intentionally seeking to put up some guardrails, intentionally seeking to protect themselves. Here in just a bit, we're going to leave, and when we get home, my family's going to have lunch. And one of the things that we're going to do with our 2-year-old is to put a bib on him. And the reason that we are is because we're going to intentionally seek to guard him from what we know could mess him up. Someone that has a useful, meaningful walk with God is going to seek to intentionally guard themselves against what could mess them up. Listen, it is possible that while you are watching this or that you are here in person, you might pat yourself on the back to say, well, I'm a religious person. I'm worshiping God. But it's entirely possible at the same point that you're kind of checked out. I mean, though you may be here or you may be watching this, you're kind of checked out because you say whatever you want. I mean, the stuff that comes out of your mouth doesn't sound any different from people that would never darken the doors of a church, that wouldn't say at all that they've got a relationship with God. Maybe it is that you're helping people in some form or fashion, small or great. But if the curtain's pulled back, you're doing so because you're trying to get notoriety out of it, trying to get some attention, trying to get some sort of payback. Maybe it is that you're here or you're watching, but I mean, later today you'll be watching something that you know is out of bounds. Allowing influences, whether that's music or movies or it's whatever, that you know could be drawing you astray. You could pat yourself on the back by saying, bravo me, I'm a person of faith. I'm a God worshiper. But it's entirely possible that what you have is useless. I don't want to have a faith that's like the employee at Costco standing beside samples that say display only. I want to have a walk with Him that matters, that is of consequence. The question is, do you want that as well? Will you bow your heads with me?